Warning, this episode is going full speed ahead into spoiler territory for the Magnus archives. I'm talking about spoiling basically everything in the show here, so if you have any intention of listening to it, which you should if you haven't already, bookmark this page and book it out of here so you can enjoy the series in its true glory. Also, this episode is going to feature in-depth discussions of fear, in particular as they relate to madness, impossible geometry, evil doors, and gaslighting. As a result, viewer discretion is advised. Oh, and a massive thank you to the Magnus Archives wiki, which was very useful in getting the info for this video together. Hey y'all, I'm Afton G here, and welcome back to the only channel where the G stands for gaslighting. Yes, today we're back from the hallways and ready to start in on the next episode of our Entities Explained series. If you hadn't noticed yet, I'm a bit of a TMA fan, and I noticed a shocking lack of Magnus video essays, so I've decided to change that. In the world of the Magnus Archives, there are, debatably, 15 entities, and we're almost halfway through explaining them one by one. If you want to see which entities I've already covered, then there should now be an iCard in the top right corner, though I'd recommend watching through this one first. You know, since leaving the video so early hurts the algorithm. Anyways, yes, today we're crossing that threshold and talking about the spiral. Before we continue on with the video, it's time once again for me to remind you that subscribing is totally free, easily reversible, and means you'll be more likely to see my videos. Also, it just helps the channel grow, which is a great benefit on its own. Anyways, thank you so much for watching, and let's continue with the rest of the video. The spiral, also known as the twisting deceit, it is not what it is, and es mentiras, a Spanish phrase roughly translating to it is lies, is madness manifest. As you may have guessed from the name, the spiral has a particular tendency towards patterns, fractals, hallucinations, illusions, and, obviously, spirals. It uses these spinning, twisting curves to convince its victims that their observed reality is perhaps not as real as it first appears, focusing on ideas of altered perception and the concept that your mind might be lying to you. Your enemies with the spiral aren't just internal, though. Deception and lies in their many forms, including gaslighting, false friendships, and hollow smiles, are a favorite of the twisting deceit. Within your mental prison, expect to see things that cannot be, impossible geometry or architecture, and strange mazes full of long corridors, doors, and mirrors. Basically, if you've ever stayed up for 3 days straight and started to wonder if the walls are moving or if it's just you, you've gotten right to the core of what the spiral stands for. And probably need to take a nap. Watch out for those doors while you're at it, or you might just have a nasty run-in with the first of the characters associated with the spiral, the self-described throat of delusion incarnate, which we usually just hear referred to as the distortion, is probably the branch of it is not what it is that we see the most of throughout the series. Through its own words, for what value they have in truth, the distortion implies that it has always existed in some way, which is interesting given that we know the entities themselves did develop at some point, but I do not have the time to go into that now. Regardless, the distortion is, at its most basic form, a door to all the places that were never there, appearing wherever it likes to toy with its victims. At the end of a hallway, high up on a building, or even buried below cement, that twisting door is just about everywhere. The distortion is a being that seems specifically to focus on the weak, panicked, and mentally unwell, constantly terrorizing them in subtle ways until finally taking the poor individual into itself. Once an unfortunate individual goes through its door, they'll find themselves in a near-infinite maze of identical ugly hallways surrounded by mirrors, paintings, and photographs, left to roam the corridors. They may find a way out, if the distortion allows them to escape, by breaking certain mirrors, but most end up trapped forever, maybe killed by a monster of the tunnels or otherwise digested, as their exact fates are never revealed. A particularly unfortunate few who had the forethought to bring in or create a map of the place would find themselves at the center of the distortion, at which point they may become the human element of the creature. During a failed attempt at the Great Twisting, this exact thing would happen to a terribly unlucky archival assistant named Michael Shelley, to create Michael, the distortion's first human form, which seems very keen on reminding John and the audience that it was not the Michael who went through the door, nor the door as it existed before, but something else entirely. There is an argument to be made that there was something like the distortion's contorted form of an unfortunately infused assistant before the Great Twisting, as Ivo Lensick's father claims to be stalked by a man with all the bones in his hands, soon after becoming obsessed with fractals in 1996, well over a decade before the distortion would gain a humanoid form, but it's also very possible that this was simply an early continuity error. Eventually, Michael violently takes on a new form, this time being transformed into Helen Richardson, a real estate agent who found her way to the distortion's core after being taken by it. Helen then follows the rest of the cast around, interacting much more with the archival staff than her predecessor, until she is destroyed by John in the post-change world. The distortion was apparently quite friendly with another manifestation of the Spiral, known only as Gabriel. Apparently the Spiral isn't a big fan of surnames. Gabriel was the key figure responsible for the attempt at the Great Twisting, being a clay worker who created most of the structures on that forgotten island. Gabriel's clay structures were incredible in life, twisting and folding into headache-inducing forms, but they apparently weren't good enough to prevent the fall of his ritual, causing Gabriel to rip out all of his veins and return to the mud. Similar on a conceptual level to Michael is the Lichtenberg creature, which torments Michael Crew, taking the arcing fractal form of a Lichtenberg figure. For those of you who don't study up on electrical movement in your spare time, Lichtenberg figures are discharges that run across insulating materials to form unique patterns, often seen in the burn scars exhibited by those who have been struck by lightning, like our friend Mike. Eventually, though, it gets trapped in Ex Altiora, and was presumably either destroyed or banished in some way when the book was burned by Jerry Key in 2012. There is the man upon the stair who was not there and will not remain being in the places he is not, an obvious reference to William Hughes Mearns' recognizable poem Antigonish. If you want an episode which perfectly encapsulates the absolute insanity of the Spiral, this is the one. I've listened to it at least 5 times and still have no idea what's going on. There are 3 characters remaining who are strongly tied to the Spiral. The first is Sergei Yushanka, who many associate with the extinction because of the whole technology integrating humanity themes, but it's a very Spiral episode on its own, so it needs to be mentioned here. There's Dr. David, who convinces people with mental health issues that they're making them up in some form of awful reverse therapy gaslighting, and most debatably, Father Edwin Burroughs. While you could make a really strong argument for him belonging to the flesh, the web, the eye, the stranger, or the desolation, with some community theorists even going so far as to say that this was the web's first attempt at marking one individual with every power, I think his plight most aligns with the Spiral, given the distinct collapsing of reality he experiences. I don't know, though. I suppose y'all can just argue it out in the comments. Please be civil, though. I don't want to have to clean up any bodies. Given how long that last section was, you'll probably be quite excited to hear that the Artefacts section is going to be graciously short. Interestingly, the Spiral has no confirmed Lightners or otherwise magical books, though it can be presumed that such books existed at one point, given that the Distortion, or something like it, participated in the raid of the library of Jürgen Leitner. As a result, there are only 2 items of note belonging to the Spiral. The first is an old Jiazhong-era pot covered in blue fractal patterns. The owner of the pot will begin to lose things, small at first until eventually adding up to, the husband, and apparently there's some kind of being living inside the pot. This led to a really distressing realization as I was researching this video. If the pot can make people forget things, and if items are randomly disappearing, and if there's something living in the pot, what if that thing crawls out of the pot, steals things from you, and then makes you forget you ever saw it? I will now be haunted by dreams of some pale nightmare fuel creature clawing its way out of a tiny pot, snatching a pen right out of your hand, and then disappearing before you can even remember to scream. Jesus Christ. Anyways, the other item is the much less iconic pattern rug, which is a rug with a peculiar detachable pattern that can change the things around it to move. This idea seems all fine and dandy, until suddenly it's crawling up your body, twisting flesh and bone and organ into incomprehensible shapes. Not exactly how I want to spend my weekend. Given the nature of the spiral, there aren't a whole lot of locations associated with it. There is a theoretical billboard outside of Lydia Halligan's apartment advertising coffee with shifting messages, but I'm not sure how much I'd trust seeing things through the veil of a dream. Please refer to my earlier statement about not sleeping if you don't believe me. According to Robin Lennox, everyone's favorite dog walker, the spiral has also manifested a complex hedge maze, although we know very little about it from a practical standpoint. Finally, there's Zamla Sanikova, or Sanikov Land, an island off the northern coast of Russia which no one seems to be able to find, probably because it doesn't exist. On that little island that cannot be was where the only spiral ritual we know of, the Great Twisting, took place, occurring sometime between 2009 and 2011, judging by off-comments from Sculptor's Tool and the Librarian. The Great Twisting would use the strange architecture of the island, the works of Gabriel, the fear of the many trapped individuals, and at the center of it all, the distortion, a gateway to all the things that were not, in order to change the world. Unfortunately for them, Gertrude Robinson had other plans, and threw one of her assistants into the distortion, giving it a tangible form and thus bringing about the collapse of the entire ritual. I hope y'all know how hard it is describing events mostly known by how incomprehensible they are. Post-change, the spiral actually fares much better on the location front than in the world before. Wonderland House is the first spiral domain we come across, helmed by Dr. David, which feeds off the fear that mental issues are fake and of abusive mental health care. David's treatments generally aren't very helpful though, which creates a constant cycle of fear. The monument, which we've mentioned in the Eye video, has very strong ties to the spiral, given how much attention is put on constant changing, hubristic punishments, and impossible geometry. Also, it's basically just a giant maze, not to be confused with the other giant maze, the Distortion, which is the physical manifestation of the entity of the same name in the form of a giant hotel. Here, Helen leads plenty of people astray, sending them down endless hallways with a friendly smile and a few quick words. The prison has some elements of the spiral as well, as so much of the fear is generated through insistence of crimes which the convicted never committed. The briefly mentioned mirror maze, spiral maze, and endless supermarket all may also belong to the spiral, but as we've never seen them, we don't know much else, which is kind of on brand for the spiral. Given the nature of the spiral, it's difficult to know where its alliances truly lie, but we can make some fair guesses. If nothing else, the spiral definitely acts aggressively towards the corruption, given Sasha and Michael's little road trip to deal with a branch of the Flesh Hive, and the Stranger, given Michael's opposition to both the Not Them and the Circus's attempts to kill the Archivist. That isn't to say that it seems to like the Eye, but it does help them frequently enough that you could make a fair argument for it. Conceptually, it is quite similar to the Dark and the Stranger, and the subtle manipulations of the spiral's gaslighting aren't far in effect from the Hidden Machination, but that's about all we have to go on. Now it's time for me to try and analyze the spiral, and I can already tell that this is going to be quite the chore. Let's start with the part you already know is coming. How the spiral fits into my ongoing super theory about how the Magnus Archives is a story about storytelling. In the story allegory, the spiral is definitely the hardest I've had to explain so far, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. I think, given the connections between the spiral and architecture, especially of the weird variety, that the spiral could be seen as a stand-in for setting. More specifically, though, I think that the spiral could be seen as the archetypical otherworld, a place where the established rules and logic make no sense. In many fantasy stories, it's the location where much of the plot occurs, while other stories pose it as a sort of threat. This even pops up in folklore and mythology, from simple concepts of underworlds to the plane of the Fae, or even just places with a strange air, like an empty cabin in the woods. This also ties nicely into the idea of liminal spaces, which I absolutely adore, and you can definitely get a spirally sense of wrongness from many such images. The spiral really does represent a unique kind of wrongness compared to what, say, the stranger stands for. The stranger takes the normal and makes it abnormal before injecting the fear, but the spiral simply skips the middleman and injects fear directly into the normal. It lives not on the fringes, but in the uneventful and the transitional spaces we pay no mind to. The spiral is the stairwell, the hallway, the hotel, and the threshold. It's the places that never should have been observed for too long, and become frightening when you do. Over the past few years, a very familiar internet liminal space, the backrooms, became very popular, and I think that both ideas work for the same reason. It's fear of the intense mundanity. This even applies to the more cerebral manifestations of the spiral. After all, what's more drab than the mind? Something we all live with every day. Still, we all experience moments of peculiarity where the lines of reality start to slip. They, like the hallways and landings and hotels, were never meant to be focused on, and to do so forms one of mankind's greatest fears: madness. When the normal and everyday become untrustworthy, when we can no longer trust the normal to be quite so normal. That's where the spiral resides, and that's why it's so damn scary. Whew, that got a little intense at the end, but I suppose with that, this brings an end to our coverage of the spiral. Let me know if I missed anything. It's bound to happen when you run on as little sleep as I do. Or just leave a comment to tell me what you thought. I'm always happy to learn about new ways I can improve what I do. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new, and be sure to keep an eye out for the next episode, where we'll be talking about... Does the slaughter really not have any cool alternate names? Huh. Well, that's disappointing. Anyways, I'm Afton Geek here, and this has been Entities Explained. Good night, YouTube people.